Welcome back to Turning Point Tuesday on SecretSpool. I'm Nina, and tonight's story is for anyone who has ever loved someone deeply while wondering if your values quietly pull you in different directions. Relationships don't always fracture from a dramatic event. Sometimes, the breaking point hides in the small moments where we don't quite understand each other. Tonight's story is about how I learned to face those differences honestly, without losing the love that brought us together. Let's dive in. When I first met my boyfriend, the connection felt almost unreal. We were young, excited about the future, and stumbling into a kind of love that didn't feel rushed, but somehow felt immediate. Even though we were long distance, he always made the effort. Late-night calls, surprise visits, long drives just to spend a few hours together. He didn't just tell me he cared, he showed it in every thoughtful detail. And the truth is, I fell for him faster than I expected. Back then, I was convinced nothing serious could ever come between us. Our early conversations felt light and playful, filled with curiosity about the tiny things that make a person who they are. Favorite snacks, awkward childhood stories, the dreams we weren't afraid to say out loud. Everything felt easy, effortless, like we had skipped ahead to the part where two people just fit. But as weeks turned into months, our talks naturally deepened. That's when I started feeling small shifts, subtle pauses in conversation, quiet hesitations when a topic turned serious. They weren't conflicts, exactly, but moments where I sensed we weren't aligning the way I'd imagined. Moments where I realized that loving someone doesn't automatically mean you share the same lens on the world. I've always believed that values shape how a person moves through life. To me, political beliefs weren't just opinions. They were reflections of empathy, fairness, how you view people who aren't like you, and what you believe we owe each other. I wasn't hyper-political. I just cared deeply about the world and the impact of my choices. Those beliefs guided everything from what I consumed to how I expressed myself. He, on the other hand, grew up in a traditional religious household where politics were mostly background noise. He saw those conversations as arguments without purpose, dramatic, exhausting, and rarely meaningful. Because of that, he didn't understand why it mattered so much to me that the people closest to me shared similar values. To him, love was love. Agreement wasn't a requirement. He didn't see beliefs as potential deal breakers, the way I sometimes did. When political topics came up, he often repeated viewpoints he'd grown up hearing, not because he'd thought deeply about them, but because they were familiar. And I realized something important. People don't always choose their beliefs. Sometimes they inherit them. He wasn't closed-minded. He just hadn't examined those ideas the way I had examined mine. It wasn't ignorance. It was inexperience. One conversation that stuck with me was when I shared more openly about being bisexual. I wasn't looking for approval, just understanding he wasn't hateful or dismissive, but he believed it was something that should stay private. He mentioned that it could confuse kids, and although he said it gently, the implications stung. Not because he meant harm, but because it revealed a gap between how we saw authenticity, identity, and openness. Another small but telling moment came when we talked about my vegetarian lifestyle. I explained my reasons: environmental impact, ethics, personal comfort. He grinned and jokingly called me extreme for it. He said it lightly, like a tease, but the word clung to me. Not because it hurt my feelings, but because it showed how differently we viewed responsibility. What felt like a thoughtful choice to me seemed dramatic to him. Then there were the conversations about our futures. I talked about ethical consumption, reducing waste, and building a life that felt aligned with my values. He talked about achieving financial success, quickly and boldly. Not in a greedy way, just in a determined, almost single-minded way. Money represented security to him. To me, security came from intention, sustainability, and community. Neither of us was wrong, just different. Little by little, I felt a quiet fear settling in. Not fear of him, but fear of the disconnect. Fear that love alone might not be enough if our visions of the world kept pulling us apart. Fear that one day we'd look at each other and realize we wanted futures that weren't just different, but incompatible. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow, subtle, and heavy in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't felt it. When he told me he'd educate himself, I appreciated his heart immediately. He wanted to learn because he loved me. But when he started looking things up, he gravitated toward information that supported what he already believed. It wasn't intentional. It was simply the path of least resistance. And that's when it hit me. The problem wasn't a lack of knowledge. It was a lack of practice in questioning his worldview. And suddenly, I was afraid of something bigger, the idea of becoming his guide instead of his partner. I didn't want him reshaping himself just to make me comfortable. I didn't want to become the person who corrected him or taught him. I loved him too much to turn our relationship into a lesson plan. And I loved myself too much to pretend my values weren't as central to me as they were. There was also the unspoken power imbalance, the one neither of us addressed. I was finishing my master's degree, building independence, and stepping into my adult life with clarity. He was still finding his footing, living with his parents, uncertain of his next steps. I worried that my confidence could unintentionally overshadow him, and that he might start agreeing with me simply because he didn't want conflict. So one night, I told him everything, not with anger, not with frustration, but with honesty that scared me. I said I didn't want him changing his beliefs just to keep me. I said I needed a partner who challenged himself, who questioned things, who grew with me, not around me. I told him I loved him deeply, but I couldn't ignore the fear that our differences might quietly shape our future in ways we didn't intend. He didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. He said, "I don't want to become your reflection. I want to become someone who stands beside you." He admitted that many of his beliefs were inherited, not chosen. He admitted he feared I would outgrow him. Hearing him speak so openly cracked something open in both of us, an honesty we'd never reached before. For the first time, we weren't debating. We weren't trying to win. We were trying to understand. He told me he wanted to learn, not to impress me, but because he wanted to understand the world beyond what he'd been taught. He said he didn't want to avoid difficult conversations anymore. He wanted to grow through them. That night, we made a promise. Neither of us would try to change the other. Instead, we would talk openly, share what shaped us, ask questions instead of assuming, and listen without trying to fix the other person. We realized alignment didn't require uniformity, just respect, curiosity, and a willingness to grow. Since then, our conversations have grown deeper. He now asks thoughtful questions instead of shutting down, and I respond with more patience and less urgency. We still disagree, but our disagreements don't feel like barriers anymore. They feel like opportunities to understand each other better. We're still learning, still growing. And for the first time, I feel confident we're walking forward together instead of drifting apart. That night didn't erase our differences, but it gave us a map for navigating them with honesty and grace. And sometimes, that's the real turning point. Not leaving a relationship, but learning how to communicate in ways that make it stronger. Thanks for listening to tonight's Turning Point Tuesday. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more daily stories from SecretSpool. I'm Nina, and I'll see you next time.